I'm with Josh Reinstein from the Knesset Christian Allies Caucus. First of all, Josh, what is the Knesset Christian Allies Caucus?
Well, the Knesset Christian Allies Caucus is a group in the Israeli parliament of members of parliament from left to right, religious to secular, that work together to mobilize direct lines of communication, cooperation, and coordination with Christian leaders around the world, whether it be political leaders, leaders of organizations, or churches. We realize that in the 21st century, there needs to be a new relationship between Jews and Christians in support of Israel, and we work to develop what we call faith-based diplomacy.
Is that relationship good at the moment?
Absolutely. I think that this year is probably the most successful year for faith-based diplomacy. A lot of the things that we're seeing around the world, from the Tel Aviv embassy move to Jerusalem, the U.S. embassy, to the Guatemalan embassy, to a lot of the anti-BDS legislation, are happening because of grassroots Christians making a stand and demanding of their parliaments and their governments to stand with the State of Israel.
Now, you just came back from the UK and spoke in the British Parliament. What were you speaking about inside Parliament?
We met with our sister caucus, the British Parliamentary Israel Allies Caucus. It's headed up and chaired by a Member of Parliament, Mark Pritchard, and he hosted an event to discuss BDS, the newest form of anti-Semitism, and EU regulations on labeling goods from Judea, Samaria, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, which we see as a revitalization of the Nuremberg laws of the 30s, where they're once again labeling Jewish goods, unfortunately, in Europe.
So this was members of the Knesset and British Parliament meeting together. Which MKs from Israel went, and which MKs did you meet in the UK?
We met with several MKs and a couple cabinet ministers as well. I don't remember all the names. As I said, it was hosted by Mark Pritchard. We came with two members of Knesset. We always try to do everything bipartisan here. Someone from the Likud, Sharon Haskell, who's the acting chairperson of the Knesset Christian Allies Caucus, as well as Orit Farkas-Cohen, who's from the Blue and White Opposition Party. These issues like BDS and anti-Semitism are not partisan politics here. Both the right and the left stand together against this new form of anti-Semitism.
How dangerous is the BDS movement, and are they powerful, and are they winning the boycott of Israel race?
I think they're losing the boycott of Israel race. We can see this in trade all over the world. The anti-BDS legislations in 27 states that kind of took $3.5 trillion off the table for any company that wants to be involved in BDS has really been effective. We saw this with the case of Airbnb, where they had to retract their boycott of Judea and Samaria. The problem with the BDS is that it's becoming something that is seen as normal and mainstream, and really what it is anti-Semitism. They've basically taken the idea of boycotting Jews in the 30s, and they just replaced the word Jew with Israel. So instead of boycotting Jewish professors, now they say boycott Israeli professors. Instead of saying don't do business with Jewish businesses, they say don't do business with Israeli businesses. And it's a very scary thing to see this become talked about in the mainstream. We have members of parliament in the UK who are supporting the BDS, and just to be unabashedly anti-Semitic like that, I think is a dangerous policy.
It's basically anti-Semitism wearing a different hat, isn't it? And it's trying to be more legitimate because you can't be anti-Semitic.
I think that all anti-Semitism is the same, but they try to mask it in different ways. They talk about the blood libel of the Jewish people, where they said that we were using Christian children's blood to make matzah for Passover. Now they're saying we're giving poison candies to children in Gaza. I mean, it's the same idea of this evil Jewish people coming in and usurping another land. But think about it logically. What people have a greater claim to the land than the people of Israel to the land of Israel? It makes absolutely no sense. This is the same virus of anti-Semitism that we see spreading all over the world. And in Europe, they started this idea to say, no, we're anti-Zionist, not anti-Jewish. And today, I think that mask has kind of fallen. A lot of them are saying, okay, we don't like Jews too. It's not just Israel. They're against circumcision. They're against kosher slaughter. And it's getting to an extreme in Europe that we haven't seen since the 1930s. And I think people need to wake up and realize that this anti-Semitism is the same roots of all anti-Semitism that we've seen throughout history, and it's very dangerous.
Does boycotting Israel actually damage the Palestinian livelihood as well?
I think it damages the Palestinians a lot more than Israel. I mean, our economy is booming. We're one of the fastest-growing economies in the Western world. We do incredible business. I think 1 out of every 6 medications in the UK comes from Israel today. We're the startup nation. Where it really damages is coexistence, because what happens is that you have these factories in Judea and Samaria that majority of the workers are from the Palestinian Authority. If they get boycotted, then it's the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian workers that lose their jobs, not the Israelis. They'll just move to some other place and hire Israelis. So it doesn't really have an effect on our economy as per se. It affects coexistence and affects people who believe in peace.
A prime example of that is SodaStream, isn't it?
Yeah, SodaStream, I think they lost 300 Palestinian jobs. They just moved down to the Negev, hired Israelis, and it's a shame. Those were 300 Palestinians that were making a good living, and because they were being internationally boycotted, they felt that they couldn't have their business model work in Judea and Samaria, and they moved to the Negev. Now, as you know, the end of the story is that they were sold for, I think, $3.6 billion to Pepsi, so it didn't hurt SodaStream. Yeah. They actually did pretty well, but those Palestinians never got their jobs back, and that's really the goal, is to destabilize peaceful efforts of coexistence between Palestinians and Jews, because the end goal is the destruction of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. You know, they say we're not against the Jewish people, we're just against Israel. Well, who do you think lives in Israel? Half the Jewish population of the world lives in Israel. This is the only Jewish state, so you can't be against Israel and not be against the Jewish people.
How are Jews and Christians fighting the BDS movement?
I think they're fighting it extremely effectively. I think the best example would be the state legislation in America. It started in South Carolina as Christians got involved with the political process and spoke to their state legislators to make a law that made it illegal for the state to contract with anyone who's involved in BDS or invest in any funds that are involved in BDS. And this spread like wildfire to Texas, to Florida, to Ohio. It's now in 27 states, as I said. And I think this could be a great example of how Christians got involved in the process and put out a political win. But I think it's not just at BDS. You see the embassies moving to Jerusalem. That's a very big effect of faith-based diplomacy and Christians and Jews working together, as well as other things where it comes to, you know, recognition of the Golan or the fighting of the horrible Iran deal. There's some big things happening in Judeo-Christian relations, and thank God we're seeing Christians wake up and take a stand on the state of Israel.
Can someone truly boycott Israel? Israel is doing so much good around the world and being a light to the nations. Could you really actually boycott Israel? Wouldn't you just have to live in a cave?
Yeah, at this point you would have to live in a cave, but I don't think they're trying to, you know, they're not boycotting the cell phone or the laptop or the Pentium chip that was developed in Israel, or text messaging, or the answering machine, or CAT scans that are all developed in Israel. They're boycotting, you know, people selling wine and people selling oranges, and really it's a destabilization process. What they're trying to do is they're trying to stop Israelis from hiring Palestinians, so that there is something what they call normalization, or that there's a normal relationship between Jews and Palestinians in the land of Israel. They are against that, and I think that is really the crux of the whole thing. They're anti-peace, they're not pro-peace, they're anti-Semitic, they're not pro-coexistence.
Now, you were also talking about anti-Semitism in Parliament. Are you worried about the rise of anti-Semitism across Europe?
Absolutely. I think it's becoming very scary. You have one party in London or in England right now that is run by an unabashed anti-Semite. I mean, just yesterday you've had people leave the Labour Party because they just couldn't be involved in such anti-Semitism. There's a mass exodus of Jewish people from the Labour Party in London because of it, and this is the same in parties all across Europe. As I mentioned before, there are movements to try to ban circumcision. Well, that means that no Jewish person can have children in that country. What does that mean? They have to leave, or kosher food, so they can't have a meal. They're attacking the roots of Judaism and the culture of Judaism in a way that it makes it impossibly Jewish in Europe today. And then you take a case of the Irish Parliament. They're passing laws, crazy laws. They've done to a third reading now that if you buy anything in East Jerusalem or Judea and Samaria, you can be punished in 5 years of jail and a huge fine. That means if you go to the old city and you buy a souvenir, you can go to jail for 5 years in Ireland if that passes. I mean, that's just blatant anti-Semitism. It's a horrible trend. But I think this time around, because we have the Jewish state of Israel, the real victims are going to be Europe. I think that Europe, at least Western Europe, is in big trouble. They're near collapse, and radical Islam is taking a real foothold there. And they think by appeasing radical Islam and feeding Israel to the crocodiles that they'll be last. But it's not the case. They're going to be first, and I think we're going to see a real erosion of democracy and freedom in those countries because of their embracement of anti-Semitism and pro-Islamist behavior.
Should Jews start returning home to Israel?
Look, I don't know if it's the time where Jews should be running for their lives. I think that we're not too far from that. But at this point, I believe that all Jews should live in Israel. I believe it's a commandment by God that during these times when he's doing the ingathering of the exiles, the Jews need to return from the south and the north and the east and the west. And we're seeing that. Within 3 years, there'll be more Jews in Israel than the rest of the world combined. So I think that is something very positive. Do people need to take haste and run now? I don't think we're at that point yet, but I can certainly see it up ahead. You know, Winston Churchill says the farther we look back, the further ahead we can see. And you don't need to look too far back to see what happened the last time that there were boycotts against Jewish businesses in Europe.
As a Jew, is anti-Semitism a demonic root?
Look, I think anti-Semitism is just like Israel. It's the tip of the sword. What they're against is God. They're against God's commandments. They're against God's Bible. They're against God's prophecy. And so the Jewish people, who is a nation that's supposed to stand alone, to be a light unto the nations, are always the first to be attacked in the virus of anti-Semitism. But they never are the last. It starts with the Jews, but it goes then closely to the Christians and other groups as well. Radical Islam says first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. And I think that if you look around today, the real persecution in the Middle East isn't the Jewish populations, it's the Christian populations. So we're starting to see that take hold already. Anti-Semitism is just the rejection of God and the Bible. And I think that people who believe in the Bible and the God of Israel have to be just as worried about it as the Jewish people.
Were you encouraged to see Jews and Christian leaders coming together in unity at the meeting?
Yeah, I think it was a great meeting in the British Parliament because you had the leaders of the Jewish community, the leaders of the Christian community, and you had political leaders all standing together for peace and freedom and against anti-Semitism and the BDS movement. And I think that was a really beautiful picture of maybe things to come. I hope that there's more unity in the Jewish and Christian communities in the UK and not less. And I think as we see more and more anti-Semitism, those communities will come together. But we need bold leadership in the political spheres, and we're very excited to have our chairman, Mark Pritchard. He's a courageous member of parliament. He's unabashedly standing with the state of Israel because of his beliefs in freedom and democracy. And so it's exciting to see what he's been able to put together in the British Parliament.
Are you pleased that there's a good relationship developing within the Christian community when it comes to supporting Israel?
Oh, absolutely. I think faith-based diplomacy is the most important weapon we have in our diplomatic arsenal today. It's the reason the embassy's moved. It's the reason we have anti-BDS legislation. It's the reason that we have a bloc in Africa of support. It's the reason we're having more friends in Latin America. As Christianity gets more developed and continues to come together and elect their own candidates, I think we're going to see more and more pro-Israel sentiment around the world. And it's because of Christians who believe in the Bible.
We've got a leadership challenge in the Conservative Party in the UK. Do you think that there's a good support for Israel between the two candidates?
Yeah, I think Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt both are pretty pro-Israel when it comes to the issues. I know that Boris Johnson is closer to the Trump administration, which is always a good sign, because we've never had a more pro-Israel administration in America than the Trump administration. But at the same time, I know Jeremy Hunt is also a good friend of Israel. I think whoever wins the conservative race, I think it would be good for Israel. At the same time, we usually work bipartisanly, and we have great friends in the Labour Party in the UK. But I have to say that I hope whoever wins the Conservative election destroys Jeremy Corbyn, because he's an unabashed anti-Semite, and it's frightening that half the UK population can support someone that's so anti-Semitic and so open about it, and that the Labour Party has turned into this horrible left-wing version of a fascist party of the 1930s is something that's very scary and should keep a lot of people awake in the UK.
What's your prayer finally for Jewish-Christian relations?
My prayer is that it gets stronger and stronger. These relations are something that were foretold in the Bible. It talks about the 10 Gentiles who grab the corners of that one Jew and lift him up, and that God will send a hearken to the nations, and that they'll bring back the children in their arms and on their backs. And so this is something we believe is foretold. And as Israel becomes stronger and the relationship becomes stronger, I think that the relationship between Jews and Christians will thrive and will bring real fruits, as we're seeing today. And so my blessing is that it continues and in the right direction, and that the relationship grows stronger as we continue going forward.
Okay, Josh, thank you very much.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show.